My mother slid the DNA kit across the Thanksgiving table like it was a party game, smiling too wide, too casually, and said, "Let's finally settle this." And everyone laughed, but my father didn't. His smile froze halfway, like something inside him had just cracked, and in that tiny shift, in that barely visible tightening of his jaw, I realized this wasn't a joke to him, it was a verdict waiting to happen. Smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon candles. My cousins were arguing over pie, glasses were clinking, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat because this wasn't random. It wasn't harmless fun. This was the same accusation that had followed me since I was a child, just dressed up in holiday wrapping paper. My father had never said the words directly, never stood in the kitchen and called me a mistake, but he didn't have to. Suspicion has its own language, and I grew up fluent in it. The first time I understood something was wrong, when he hesitated before lifting me onto his shoulders, like he was calculating weight that didn't belong to him. I was 14 when he told my mother, loud enough for me to hear, that he didn't believe in investing in uncertain returns. I was 18 when he skipped my graduation and said he had work, but showed up at my brother's football practice the same evening. He never accused me, he audited me. That white and blue box landed in front of me, cheerful fonts promising clarity and connection. I didn't feel embarrassed, I felt exposed, like someone had finally decided to say the quiet part out loud. My mother laughed again, touching my arm, telling everyone I was being dramatic, that it was just for fun, but her fingers were cold, and when I looked at her closely, I didn't see amusement, I saw fear, the kind of fear that lives behind carefully maintained stories. Father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the box like it held something heavier than plastic and paperwork. "Unless," he said softly, almost pleasantly, "there's something we should prepare for." The table went silent for half a second, just long enough for the meaning to settle before someone forced another laugh. To refuse. I wanted to stand up and tell him that biology doesn't define loyalty, that fatherhood isn't a math problem, but a darker thought crept in. One I hated admitting even to myself. What if he was right? What if all those years of distance weren't cruelty but instinct? What if somewhere in the architecture of my face there was proof that I didn't belong? Picked up the box. I opened it. I swabbed my cheek while everyone watched like it was entertainment, like my identity was the evening's dessert, and when I sealed the sample and placed it back on the table, my father finally smiled fully, slow and satisfied, like a man confident the numbers would confirm what he'd always believed. Testing me. But he didn't realize that once the truth came back, it wouldn't just measure blood, it would measure everything. Weeks later, when the email arrived with the subject line, "Your results are ready," the person who stopped sleeping that night wasn't me. The email arrived at 2:17 in the morning, glowing against the darkness of my bedroom like a quiet alarm no one else could hear, and for a full minute I just stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen, because once I opened it there would be no going back to doubt, no more gray space to hide in, only numbers, only proof, only something final. I had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, imagined relief, imagined devastation, imagined the strange hollow of being confirmed as someone's mistake. But what I didn't expect was the calm that settled over me as I logged into the portal and watched the loading circle spin, slow and indifferent, like it didn't understand that it was about to redraw the map of my entire childhood. Results appeared, the words were clinical, emotionless, almost insultingly neutral. Probability of paternity, 99.9998%. I read it once, then again, waiting for the decimal to shift, waiting for some hidden clause, some microscopic doubt to justify the years of suspicion. But there was none, it was absolute, undeniable, louder than any argument we had ever had. My hands didn't shake, I didn't cry, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something colder, something sharper, because the accusation that had hovered over me since I was 8 dissolved in a single line of text, and in its place rose a different question, heavier and more dangerous. If I was unquestionably his, then why had he spent my entire life acting like I wasn't? Second, I almost wished the result had been different, because uncertainty at least had an explanation, but certainty exposed something uglier, something intentional, and as I stared at the screen, I understood something that made my stomach drop. This test was never about truth, it was about control, about keeping me slightly off balance, slightly unsure, slightly grateful for scraps of approval. I wasn't the one who had been under examination all these years. He was measuring his own insecurity against my existence, and now the numbers had stripped him of his excuse. I reported the results to myself, then closed the laptop, and for the first time in my life, I slept without wondering if I belonged in my own house. But the next morning, when my father called before I could even have coffee, his voice tight, too careful, asking if I had seen the email yet, I realized something else: he hadn't slept at all. And the fear in his tone wasn't about losing me, it was about losing something much bigger. He hadn't asked me what the results said. He had asked, what else did it show? What else did it show? He repeated, and I could hear it now, the strain beneath the composure, like he was bracing for impact, not from me, but from something buried far deeper. I told him the paternity percentage first, slow and clear, letting the number hang in the silence between us, waiting for relief, for apology, for even a fraction of regret. But what I got instead was a long exhale, not of gratitude, but of calculation. And then he asked again, softer this time, and the ancestry breakdown. Paid much attention to that section at first, just skimmed past the colorful pie chart and regional percentages. But now his question felt pointed, surgical, so I reopened the portal while he stayed on the line, my pulse steady, my mind suddenly sharper than it had ever been. The breakdown was ordinary enough at a glance, a blend of regions that aligned with what my mother had always told me about our family history. But there was one detail that didn't fit, one region that neither side had ever claimed, small but undeniable, a genetic echo from a place no one had mentioned in 24 years of family stories. It out loud, there was a pause on the other end of the line so heavy I could almost feel it pressing against my ear. He didn't deny it. He didn't question the accuracy. He simply said, "That's impossible," too quickly, too firmly, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't expected. The test hadn't threatened his fatherhood, it had threatened his narrative. Life, he had positioned himself as the stable one, the rational one, the guardian of facts in a house full of emotion. But now science had introduced a variable he couldn't control, and the more I thought about it, the more something else began to form in my mind, quiet and unsettling. If that region didn't come from my mother's side, and it clearly hadn't come from his, then someone in this story wasn't who they claimed to be. Delete that, he said suddenly, the first crack in his voice finally breaking through, and it wasn't anger, it was fear, raw and unfiltered. Delete it, like it was a typo, like DNA could be erased with a keystroke. Strange, rising clarity then, the kind that doesn't shout but steadies, because for the first time, the imbalance of power in our family shifted slightly, subtly, and he knew it. He had always been the one holding doubt over my head like a weapon, but now the uncertainty hovered over him, and he didn't know how to carry it. Deleting anything, I said, and my voice didn't shake. There was another silence, longer this time, and when he finally spoke, he didn't sound like the man who had smirked across the Thanksgiving table 3 weeks ago. He sounded cornered. "Talk," he said. He insisted we meet in person, not at the house, not where walls had memories and furniture had witnessed too much, but at his office downtown, neutral ground, he called it, though there was nothing neutral about the way he controlled every environment he stepped into. When I walked in, he was already seated behind his desk, posture straight, hands folded, the same composed authority he wore in board meetings and family dinners alike, but his eyes gave him away, restless, scanning me like he was trying to assess how much I knew before I'd even spoken. Waste time on small talk. That percentage, he began, referring to the ancestry detail without naming it, as if speaking it directly might make it more real. It's a mistake. I asked how he could be so certain, and that's when he stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city below like the answer might be written in traffic patterns. Because, he said slowly, it doesn't exist in our family. The phrase felt different now, fragile. I reminded him that DNA doesn't fabricate regions for fun, that these companies verify down to microscopic markers, and instead of arguing, he turned toward me with something I had never seen on his face before, not anger, not superiority, but vulnerability wrapped in denial. "You don't understand," he said, And for the first time in my life, I believed that was true. Me about his father, my grandfather, a man I had only known through polished stories and framed photographs, a pillar of tradition, of heritage, of pride. According to my father, their lineage was clean, documented, preserved with almost obsessive care. Family trees had been drawn, rewritten, protected. There's no room for anomalies, he said, and the word hung between us like an accusation directed at someone who wasn't in the room. Clicked. This wasn't about me proving I belonged to him. It was about him proving he belonged to the man who raised him. It's not my DNA that's inconvenient? I asked quietly, and the effect was immediate, like I had struck a nerve he'd spent decades guarding. His jaw tightened, his composure flickered, and for a split second, I saw a younger version of him, not the dominant patriarch, but a son standing in the shadow of a legacy that might not be as solid as he'd believed. Back down slowly, and when he finally met my eyes, the authority was gone. If that region is accurate, he said, voice lower now, then my father lied. Felt smaller suddenly, the air thinner. All those years he had questioned my legitimacy, my belonging, my right to carry his name, and now the test had quietly suggested that the fracture in our family didn't start with me. It started one generation before. Realization settled in, heavy and irreversible. I understood why he had never truly wanted the truth. If the numbers were right, then the doubt he placed on me wasn't inherited through blood. Inherited through fear. I thought the confrontation would happen slowly, privately, behind closed doors where pride could still pretend to survive. But it detonated 3 nights later at Sunday dinner when my father decided he couldn't carry the uncertainty alone anymore. He stood at the head of the table, glass untouched, voice steady but stretched thin, and announced that there had been an inconsistency in the DNA report, framing it like a technical glitch, a statistical anomaly, something that needed clarification. My mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. My brother looked confused. I felt the shift instantly, the same energy as Thanksgiving, but this time I wasn't the one under the spotlight. Mention percentages. He didn't mention regions. He just said, there may have been misinformation in the previous generation, and the careful wording told me he had been rehearsing this. My grandmother, who rarely spoke unless asked, slowly placed her napkin down and stared at him with a look that wasn't surprise, but recognition. That was the moment I understood this secret hadn't been sleeping. It had been buried. Saying your father wasn't your father? My brother asked, blunt in the way only someone untouched by suspicion can be. The room tightened. My father didn't answer directly. He deflected, said tests aren't perfect, said databases are flawed, said heritage companies profit from confusion. It would have worked years ago. It would have silenced me, but not anymore. Something he never expected. I pulled out my phone and read the percentage aloud, clearly, calmly, leaving no room for interpretation. I watched his composure fracture in real time. He snapped then, sharp and unfiltered, accusing me of humiliating him, of weaponizing science, of disrespecting family. The irony landed so hard it almost made me laugh. For 24 years, doubt had been my inheritance, and now that doubt had changed direction, he called it cruelty. When my grandmother finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through everything. Your father knew, she said, just 3 words, but they rearranged the entire room. His father knew, then the lie wasn't accidental. It was chosen. The silence that followed wasn't polite, it was violent. My father turned to his mother like she had betrayed him, like she had detonated something sacred, but she didn't look ashamed. She looked tired. She explained it slowly, carefully, as if unwrapping something fragile that had been hidden for decades. There had been a war, there had been an absence, there had been a man who came back different, and there had been a child conceived in the space between certainty and survival. Father had known. He had chosen to claim the child anyway, not out of ignorance, not out of weakness, but out of decision. He said blood doesn't make a father, my grandmother whispered, and I felt something inside me shift, something almost poetic in its symmetry. The man my father idolized had once faced the same truth and responded with grace. And somewhere along the way, that grace had been replaced with fear. Father stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, anger finally giving way to something more fragile. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded, and her answer was devastatingly simple. Because he didn't want you growing up feeling questioned. That sentence landed directly between us. All those years he had placed suspicion on me, he had been unconsciously replaying a story he was never meant to know. He wasn't protecting legacy. He was protecting a lie he didn't even realize he was living inside. At me then, really looked at me, and for the first time there was no dominance in his eyes, no calculation, no superiority, just realization. I had never been the anomaly. I had been the mirror. Part was beginning to surface. The final blow didn't come from me. It came from his own reflection. 2 days after that dinner, he asked me to meet him again, this time not at the office, not in a controlled environment, but at the park where he used to take my brother when we were kids, the place I had rarely been invited. He looked smaller there somehow, sitting on a bench beneath bare winter trees, hands clasped, staring at the ground like it might give him instructions. Your entire life trying to protect something that was never broken, he said quietly, and the honesty in his voice was almost unbearable. He admitted that when my grandmother's confession settled in, he realized the cruelty of what he had done. His father had chosen love over biology. He had chosen acceptance over ego. And my father, terrified of repeating a hidden shame, had chosen suspicion instead. If I kept questioning it, I'd never be blindsided, he admitted, and that was the most human thing he had ever said to me. He had been afraid, not of me, not of betrayal, but of discovering that his own foundation wasn't as solid as he believed. So he tried to control the one variable he thought he could me. And I considered walking away, letting him sit with the damage alone, because healing doesn't erase history, and 24 years of distance don't dissolve with one apology. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the story of my grandfather choosing love in silence. Maybe it was the understanding that cycles only end when someone decides they will. Always yours, I said, and this time it wasn't about DNA, it was about choice. Eyes wet but steady, and I realized something profound. Science had answered the question he asked at Thanksgiving, but the real verdict was delivered here, on that bench, in the quiet acceptance that fatherhood isn't proven by percentages. It's proven by what you decide to protect. And the test didn't expose my identity. I thought the worst was over after the dinner explosion, after my grandmother's confession, after my father's carefully controlled world cracked in front of everyone. But I was wrong, because truth doesn't settle quietly, it spreads, and within days extended family members started calling, asking questions they pretended were casual, their voices wrapped in curiosity that felt more like appetite. The story had escaped the house, and now it was circulating, reshaping reputations that had taken decades to build. Hated that more than anything, not the lie itself, not the doubt he had placed on me, but the public unraveling of a legacy he had spent his entire life protecting. He stopped going to weekly family gatherings. He ignored calls from cousins. He even avoided my grandmother for a week, as if distance could rewind what had already been spoken aloud. When I realized something dangerous, he wasn't just ashamed. He was angry, not at me, not exactly. He was angry that the narrative had slipped from his control. Evening, he confronted me in the kitchen, voice low but tight, and said, "You didn't have to read it out loud." That single sentence told me everything. He still saw the exposure as my action, not the consequence of his own choices. For a second, I felt the old instinct rise inside me, the instinct to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to smooth things over. And the truth did. The moment, the final tension snapped into place. Because now this wasn't about ancestry percentages anymore. It was about whether he would accept responsibility or look for someone else to blame. Said next almost undid everything we had rebuilt. Maybe some truths are better buried. When he said some truths are better buried, I saw the entire cycle stretching behind him like a shadow. His father choosing silence to protect a child, his mother choosing secrecy to protect a husband, and now him considering silence to protect his pride. It would have been easy for him to retreat, to quietly rewrite the narrative again, to let the family pretend the DNA report had been misinterpreted. No one outside the immediate circle knew the exact details. It could still be contained. Something had shifted inside him after that night in the park. I could see the battle happening behind his eyes: legacy or honesty, control or humility. Twist came 2 weeks later when he invited the entire family back for dinner. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just a gathering, the same table, the same room. The same people who had watched the first accusation unfold months earlier. The atmosphere was cautious, like everyone sensed something unfinished hanging in the air. Through the meal, he stood up again. My chest tightened instantly, remembering Thanksgiving, remembering the DNA kit sliding across polished wood. But this time his hands were empty. No box, no performance. Someone an apology, he said, and the room went still. He didn't speak in metaphors. He didn't blame circumstances. He didn't mention confusion. He looked directly at me and said, "I let my fear turn into doubt, and I made my daughter carry it." Dramatic music, no gasps, no cinematic explosion. Just silence so thick it felt physical. My brother stared at him. My mother covered her mouth. My grandmother closed her eyes. First time in my life, I felt the weight lift. Not because he proved I belonged, but because he finally admitted I always had. The truth that makes this moment sharper than forgiveness: apologies don't erase damage, they expose it. Exposed, everyone sees it. The last confrontation didn't happen in front of the family. It happened quietly, just the two of us, a few days after his apology, when the adrenaline had faded and the reality of what he had admitted started settling into something heavier. He asked me if we could move forward. Such simple words, such enormous meaning. Forward could be stepped over like a crack in the sidewalk. Him, really looked at him, not as the man who questioned me, not as the patriarch who controlled rooms, but as a son who had grown up unknowingly carrying someone else's hidden truth. He wasn't cruel by design. He was defensive by inheritance. Realization was the final blow. Because forgiveness isn't about pretending something didn't hurt. It's about deciding whether the person in front of you is bigger than the version of them that hurt you. One who needs to move forward, I said calmly. I never stepped back. Sentence landed harder than anger ever could. His entire life he thought I was the fragile one, the uncertain one, the possible outsider. But I had always known who I was. I had always known I belonged. It was him who had been unstable, him who had been bracing for collapse. Collapse had happened. Not of our family, not of identity. Lies. The tension in the house faded, the sideways glances stopped, the subtle comparisons between me and my brother disappeared. For the first time, I felt seen without evaluation. Not measured, not assessed, just accepted. A test never left the drawer where I stored it. I didn't throw it away. I didn't frame it. I kept it as a reminder, not of biology, but of what happens when silence goes unchallenged for too long. Gave me that kid as a joke. My father accepted it as a challenge. But what it really became. He wanted to see if I was truly his. He saw who he had become.